Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to this, the e-Memoir session, where we're looking at embedding English and Maths in study programmes. Session is going to be led by Beej Kaczmarczyk and Sue Martin. We like to keep the sessions interactive as possible, so please feel free to use the chat or question facility. I'm going to hand over to Beej now. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the introduction, Marek. And as Mike says, copies of the slides and the recording will obviously be available sometime after this afternoon's webinar. I'm joined by Sue Martin, an independent consultant. Would you just like to introduce yourself, Sue?
Good afternoon, everybody. I've spoken previously. I'm delighted to be here today.
Thanks very much. And for those of you that have listened in on previous broadcasts, you'll know that this is in a series of innovation in study programs which we've been running now for a few months. We've already done one on innovative approaches to work placements and experience, and today we're looking at embedding English and Maths in study programs, which, as you will be aware from a whole plethora of reports, not only Ofsted but comments from the Department of Education, there have been issues about the quality of English and Maths, particularly in terms of teaching, learning and assessment and outcomes for learners in study programs. So we thought it would be appropriate today to have a look at this in terms of some of the innovations that we're aware of, certainly from our practice, our support that we're offering from a large number of providers, which includes colleges, schools, academies, training providers, local authorities and other agencies. So in the course of the next hour or so, we're going to be looking at this agenda, which was your call to action. Very quickly, just going to remind people about the requirements of study programs, not only for the funding agency, EFA, but also in terms of Ofsted's perspectives, and Sue will be covering that. How maybe to approach the planning and delivering of study programs, which I think maybe sometimes providers have not actually understood fully the implications of, a much more holistic approach, which is much more centred on individual start points and individuals' most likely planned destinations and outcomes. All the way through, we're going to focus on establishing the links between English and Maths and other elements of the study program. So not only what I'd call the vocational and academic subjects, but that more holistic approach that links what is happening in the students' or learners' experience of work placements, enrichment, personal development, behaviour and welfare with the development of English and Maths skills. Some examples we'll provide in case studies, but I'm sure there are many more that we could add, and that's just simply to give you some sense of direction, some sense of advice, and obviously you can follow up on those. And then we'll finish off by having a look at what we think are some of the implications for people who are working in the study programs in different institutions. That holistic approach to planning and delivering study programs, I think it's always well worth going back to this, and this was what's underpinning really developments that occurred in the last 3 or 4 years when we first introduced study programs. Study programs are not collections of individual qualifications, and I think that is critical to understand that. That's partly why Ofsted is inspecting this as a type of learning or area of learning. And I think it really starts with a clear understanding on transition from Key Stage 4, what is the most likely destination that the young person wants. Is it into further study? Is it to employment? Is it to apprenticeships? And continuously going back to that review through your information, advice and guidance. The study program itself, as you know, is not about individual qualifications. It's about putting qualifications and non-qualification elements together in a way which gets the person from where they are on transition, the start point, to where they want to be either 1 year later, 2 years later, or 3 years later at the end of their study program. And it's important to emphasize it's not just the qualification elements, and they're obviously critical in terms of English and Maths, but also those other elements such as work experience, tutorial, enrichment, personal development, etc. So underpinning this are assumptions about the quality of teaching, learning and assessment and all the other aspects of support. And then I think at the end of the particular study program that each individual has personalized for them, it's what kind of advice we're giving them and what kind of guidance we're giving them in terms of progression to employment, to higher study and further study, and how we record that, and how we measure the impact that English, Maths, as well as their vocational academic subjects have made to the achievement of those destinations. And throughout all of this, you can see that the strand of learning support, or additional learning support as we used to call it, is a thread all the way through. And I think what some of the inspection reports have thrown out And there are over 210 inspection reports now since the new inspection framework was introduced, covering schools, training providers, colleges, have shown that in the case of study programs, there is still, in some cases, a significant failure to understand that much more holistic approach, which means that the interrelationship between all those component parts, those elements, is absolutely critical. So let's have a look at the definitions of English and Maths in terms of the requirement to embed them to meet simply a funding condition or the requirements of Ofsted. Now you'll be aware that certainly since 2014-15 we've had the funding condition that requires those young people who have not yet acquired an A star to C GCSE or grade 4 to 9 to be undertaking some form of further study in Maths or English and English if it's both as part of their study program. And that should be planned as part of the study program for each academic year in which they have not yet met the condition. And you understand the consequences of not meeting condition is the removal of those students from your lag number and therefore the loss of significant amounts of funding. So those definitions I think are well understood. They've been, by the way, revised and updated by the Education Funding Agency in a funding update published on the 27th of this month. So that was published on Monday, and hopefully if you go to the EFA website you'll find much more detail on that. The additional condition, which obviously was introduced for the current year, relates to the grade Ds, which is very clear that those students who are 16 and 17 or what we call full-time programs of at least 540 hours, or 18-year-olds who are on programs of at least 450 hours, who have not yet achieved the grade A star to C, are expected to do resits and rather than stepping stone qualifications such as functional skills. That also, of course, applies to approved IGCSE programs. And I think it's important, therefore, that it's not only that you're offering the program, but they are enrolled, the delivery of the program occurs, their attendance is monitored, as well as their progress, and the expectation that those students will, in some cases, if not all cases, will achieve the improved grade. And I think that's critical, because I think that also says that, well, it's not necessarily dependent on the nature of the rest of their program, what kind of English or Maths they're doing. But I think what it is critical here is that for the grade Ds, the expectation is, certainly for your full-time students, although it doesn't apply to those that are defined as part-time, would be doing a resit, if not in one, if not in both, certainly at least one of them, as is the case for many of the students that come into our institutions. Now that, if you want, in terms of what meets the condition, the approved list of qualifications was updated on the 27th of this month. So you see that, unlike you first expected, the old, better known as the legacy GCSEs, they will be approved for another teaching year, which means that resits and retakes will be permitted for those students that are entering into your programs this year, who are aged 16 and over on the 31st of August. And that means there'll be a resit opportunity in November 2016 and obviously summer 2017. The expectation is that those other learners who are doing the new GCSEs that were introduced this year, but it's also important to the third point to note that the IGCSEs, those which we not call legacy, but the regulated ones, which count towards the EBAC measures, their life has also been extended for another year. So in effect, this is the last year of registrations on those programs. The other conditions have not changed significantly. Functional skills, the freestanding maths units, ESOL, again, is a stepping stone. The modular stepping stone qualifications at entry and level 1, the ones that are defined as meeting the requirements, don't forget that. The full Princess Trust team program, and I think also an updated list of level 3 qualifications, which will also count towards meeting the condition. So that's the approved Maths and English Language AS A-level, core Maths, International Baccalaureate Maths, further Maths, and the OCR Maths for engineering. These are all at level 3. So again, it's critical that before we get into the details of embedding English and Maths into your study programs, you understand that which qualifications will allow to count towards the funding condition, and don't fall foul of that funding condition. I think the clarification that exists in terms of what we mean by meeting the funding condition, it's about enrolled on a program, and obviously you might determine at what point they might actually complete the program. It might be a one-year program, it might be a two-year program. It is absolutely essential from the point of view of Ofsted, as well as the funding condition, that the students have timetable to attend lessons, whatever form of delivery that is, whether it be face-to-face or blended learning, whatever. And also not to ignore the qualifying period. So if you have a student who maybe not got a grade D before, but a different grade, if they've been doing functional skills, they achieve those functional skills before the end of the academic year, then you should have an opportunity to put them onto a higher level, or for example GCSE, and make sure they have at least 6 years, it might take that, 6 weeks at least to complete, or at least to start the program. It might then go into the second year of the study program, but that's not an issue. So again, it's just to make sure you meet the qualifying period. Flexibility is critical because remember, for those part-time students, you can use the stepping stone qualifications. For students on programs of less than 150 hours, they are not required to do any of that list of qualifications, but you must still include some English and Maths content and record a start point in terms of what they might be doing, in terms of milestones, or even use maybe, if you can, for those shorter periods, some of those shorter certificates, those modular certificates. That also applies to smaller part-time programs, which might be 150 or less hours, traineeships, Job Centre Plus as well, supported internships. And again, there's a flexibility in the way in which you can deliver those programs. So you can start in a functional skill if they haven't got a grade D and then progress to GCSE before the end of the academic year, or you can have intensive programs that get the person ready just for the November retake. Or again, if you've got students who've already got the funding condition, they've met the funding condition and got a grade A star to C or 4 to 9, then you can obviously still put on additional English and Maths classes where that helps those learners to gain some more confidence or be more fit for the programs they're actually studying. So I think it's important therefore to update yourselves on what we call the funding condition, because before you can embed the English and Maths appropriately in the study program, you must realise that of course that is to meet those conditions. Sue, would you like to just now look at why it's important to also make sure you meet the requirements of Ofsted?
Thank you. Yes, Beej. I think it's really useful, as you said, just to keep an eye on the funding conditions as well, because unfortunately that does have a huge impact, you know, for providers as well. Now we know obviously that the inspection, the common inspection framework has changed, and it is it is different, and it is a much more holistic approach. So what we've got on the screen there is obviously the key themes that will be looked at. So we know, for example, that the design of the curriculum includes all the elements of the study program. It's really important to consider the careers advice and guidance, the learner's progression. We've got the new element of the personal development, behaviour and welfare, but what does stand out particularly is the development of English and mathematics skills for the learners. Now that includes those that already have achieved A star to C, as well as those that are actually having to do the subjects again. So it is important that the development of those skills is what is highlighted throughout all areas of the actual common inspection framework. So if we look at the different strands, moving on to the different sections within the framework, you can see there that English and mathematics does play such a high profile. It's very, very important, and it is referenced throughout all the different elements. Recently there has been information people will have seen on different websites that some colleagues in the sector are saying that Ofsted isn't just looking at English and mathematics. Now we know that isn't what is the only thing that's been looked at, but you can see from the reports and you can see from the framework itself how often the development of English and Maths does actually come into play. So from the leadership and management aspect, you can see it's really, really critical that there is a strategic priority given to provision of English and Maths. And again, it's about learners improving the levels of the skills compared to their starting point. So it's all about it being relevant. in the teaching and learning and assessment part, we've got to consider again, is the English and Maths and ICT that the learners are doing actually helping them to achieve, is it helping them to develop their skills even further? And if we have a look at the next slide of personal development, behaviour and welfare, again we've got English and mathematics is written within there, so you can see that English and Maths is critical. Although we're developing the learners' employability skills, giving them the behaviours and developing those skills, make them ready for the next step, and also to move into the world of work, the English and the Maths plays a key role. It goes without saying that the outcome for learners is obviously critical, and again we're looking at the development of English and Maths that is relevant to the career aims or the learning goals for that young person, but also taking into account the starting point. So it's all about the relevance, and I think the key point that you made earlier on, Beej, about the holistic approach is critical to making sure that we do actually get this right, because the English and Maths part is not going to go away. You know, it's something that we do need to continue addressing. We can see as well that some colleagues may recognise some of these points, and I'm sure they've read many of these statements as well from some of the reports. These are some of the examples that have come through from some of the inspection reports, which highlights the areas where the English and Maths hasn't gone quite as well as people had hoped. So we've got things in there that people will be aware of not enough links to the vocational part of the study programme, too much emphasis placed on exam practice. We know that's important, you can't ignore it, but it can't be the main thing that's actually driving the development of skills, and that targets aren't necessarily linked to the learner's starting point, and they're maybe not individualised as well. There's been quite a few instances where the teaching, learning and assessment has been over-reliant on paper-based or task-based activity, and again missing that opportunity to develop further the skills, and learners are just completing worksheets, which obviously they might be busy doing those, but it's not necessarily the way that you're going to actually see if they're developing those skills.
Yeah. So that's critical then, isn't it, Sue, that if you're looking at the sort of two conditions together, I call it the funding condition and the quality condition, I think it's important to stress how important it is that much more holistic approach. Would you agree?
Definitely, definitely. I think it's the only way forward. That's the whole point really of the study programme, that it is meant to be a holistic approach to the learning.
That's great. Now, thanks, Sue, and Sue will also add as we go through this approach that we're suggesting to you. Well, we've got three outstanding questions, and I think we can just answer them very briefly. A question for one of you, and that is, in terms of we can apply study programs to 16 to 19-year-olds who are doing full-time or part-time programs. For apprentices who are 16 to 18, it's a requirement either of the framework or the standard. So if the requirement is of a standard is at level 2, the intermediate level, then the requirement would be that that young person achieves certainly functional skills at level 1 in both English and Maths. And if they've already achieved them, the expectation is that you will then offer the apprentice the opportunity to take that level 1 and convert it to a level 2 by making the offer and putting on the appropriate provision to support that person. And similarly, the expectation is if they're doing an advanced apprenticeship, that they certainly will be able to achieve the functional skills or the GCSEs at level 2. By the way, when I said that if you didn't meet the condition, you lose the funding, just to clarify, you lose the funding not for the English and Maths, but the whole of the student's programme. In other words, that student is removed from your lag number effect, and the loss is £4,000 if they're full-time and pro-rata. For traineeships, which are often quite short, again, although there's a requirement that you evidence that you've given the students the opportunity to improve their English and Maths skills, it is not necessarily a requirement that they're doing a qualification. In some cases, even a functional skill might not be possible in the short period you have. You might only have 8 to 12 weeks. But you must evidence that through the study program for a young person, which is again funded on a holistic basis, it's not the separate costs, it's the total hours that make up the funding for 16 to 18-year-old, that you are putting English and maths provision on to improve that young person's employability and work-related skills, but not necessarily a qualification. So thanks very much for the questions. I think our basic, if you want, thesis for today is that very often people look at embedding English and maths into study programs as very much a sort of bottom-up approach, which is true, is absolutely critical. In other words, when you deliver those individual lessons in engineering, business studies, whatever, health and social care, the English and maths is embedded into that experience. It's made relevant, it's made realistic. In effect, it transforms the young person from thinking about English and maths as separate subjects to actually key components in the learning of whatever that vocational or academic study is. However, our thesis is that this needs to happen at 3 levels. It's going to be top down, middle up, middle down, bottom up, etc. And it happens at 3 levels: the strategic level, the operational planning level, and the delivery of teaching, learning and assessment. So Sue, would you like to have a look at the strategic level with us now?
Yes, thank you. I mean, everybody will know that it is everyone's responsibility to make sure that the English and maths is working effectively across the whole of the study programs. And what we do know, we've seen from those organisations that have managed to make some improvements, is the only way to make it work really is to give the English and mathematics the high profile that it really needs. So there needs to be a strong focus across all the study programs, across all the curriculum that's actually being delivered. And to do this, I think it's really useful if there is a senior colleague in the organisation that has that accountability and responsibility, but also has got that, I suppose really you would say, authority to help drive things and to help make sure that the strategy for delivery is clearly understood by everybody in the organisation. What does work particularly well is if there's been an audit of staff skills and having a look at their own qualifications of the English and maths, because some colleagues will find this to be a little bit of a challenge. It may be some time since they've been at school, or they may just not like those subjects themselves. So again, by taking sort of stock of the types of qualifications that people have and their levels of confidence is really useful, because it's only by knowing that you're then able to adapt your strategy to meet, you know, your own sort of staffing levels. I think in line with that as well, we all know it's really difficult to actually recruit English and mathematics teachers to come and work in post-16 sectors. But that said, it is important that if those positions are available, that they do actually take priority. And what some organisations have done is managed to have some incentives in place. So there might be an added bonus to recruit somebody to come and join the organisation. Again, that needs some careful management really, because it could be that some colleagues are not too happy with that if they're not getting an incentive. But we've got to sort of put all that into the mix really and make sure it's right for each individual organisation. What I have seen work particularly well is there's been an offer for some colleagues to retrain, and this has worked particularly in areas such as the construction, plumbing and the engineering areas, where some colleagues have wanted to go and retrain in mathematics, or they're being given that opportunity, and there have been some really good schemes around as well to enable people to do that. But again, it's one of those things that can be done internally. I think it's important as well that everybody understands that it is very different, and there are a lot of demands to actually deliver the English and Maths strategy effectively. And so to do that, I think everybody needs to understand what the challenges are. It's not easy working with reluctant people who don't want to do those subjects again. You know, they've had a long time in their own school or own environment, perhaps doing those types of subjects in the same way for some time. So, you know, they're looking for something different. And I think that's where a really good, robust approach to staff development does actually play dividends. So it's useful for managers to understand the challenges and to be aware of the different types of training and development available, but it's also really helpful for specialist teachers and vocational teachers to work together. And again, there's opportunities for people to put on their own staff development and look at the skill set that's already within the organisation. What I have seen work effectively, and I've worked with some organisations to put this in place, is to actually appoint skills champions. So you will have specialist people who they have the English and mathematics as their specialism, and they're actually working with other colleagues to support upskilling. But also it may be that you've got vocational team members who have a certain passion for the subjects, and again likewise, and they become a champion within the vocational area and almost a go-between from the vocational departments and the English and Maths specialist departments as well. And I think it's absolutely critical that people have the opportunity to work together, and it's only from doing that that I think we will actually see the capacity building, and ultimately people will have the confidence and the skills to be able to actually integrate the English and Maths across the wider curriculum. So I think, Beej, you're going to look at some of the detail now, the operational aspect as well.
Yes, so I was just going to emphasise, I think, just add a few points, certainly from reviewing 210 inspection reports, and some of them, of course, have not been particularly positive, is that it really is difficult to embed English and maths effectively into study programmes or into apprenticeships or adult learning if there isn't that major commitment at the very top level. This is, we're talking about governors and senior leaders understanding they have a clear mission, which includes the delivery of high-quality English and maths as the great enabler, as well as obviously employability skills. And where that isn't the case, it's very difficult, even at the operational planning or direct, you know, when you talk about delivery on a day-to-day basis, to get that consistent, coherent approach, which is critical. Okay, well, I think at the operational level, there's some sort of clear issues that this raises for us. Just before we move on, just to clarify a couple of things. We've had a question here about apprentices. Is it a requirement for apprentices who've got GCSE English and Maths at A-star to C to study in more maths? It all depends on the individual framework or standard, which might require some updating, or in some cases, on some of the new standards, the GCSE entry at A-star to C would have to be converted to a level 3 program. You'll see that on some of the new standards, not on any, and not on any of the frameworks I'm thinking of. On traineeships, if you have a person that starts a functional skill because you think that it's appropriate for them to do that and they're able to do it at level 1 or 2, and then they leave early because they've been given a job, we remove those learners out of the qualification achievement grades, but at the same time have a look at what possibly would be their planned end date, because they might be able to achieve that inside their apprenticeship if they've gone into the apprenticeship as a progression. Any learner who does any of the additional maths and English that we described, particularly if they're doing it as a top-up when they've already got their GCSE A-star to C, that will not generate any funding unless it puts them over the threshold for the next level of hours. So if they're already on 540 hours, it will add no funding. But if the program was only 490 hours and you add on an extra 60 hours of further maths or extra English for engineers or for business studies, then that clearly would make a difference to funding for that learner. But make sure you've got all the auditable evidence for that. I mean, these are really quite critical operational issues. And of course, in terms of the operational issues, there are some things that I think are critical. And I just want to go through some of them because these relate to some of the innovations that we've seen happening in study programs which have produced good results. When I say good results, grade 2s or better, although there have not been many grade 1s in the college sector, only 2, if not 3 up to now. I want to look a little bit at flipping the core. That's flipping the word, the meaning of the word core. Having a look at timetabling and the allocation of hours, because again, if you're going to embed effective practice, particularly if you've got the skills and the expertise, it's giving some of those students greater access to more English and Maths as part of their programme, as well as using the appropriate combinations of vocational and specialist staff, which Sue talked about. One of the things that certainly seems to have worked well at the operational planning level, that is before we sit down and deliver the study programme, when we plan the study programme, something you've been doing certainly over the period usually from November to about, say, March, is to make sure that we map all of the English and Maths elements of an individual learner or individual programmes against all the different aspects of the study programme, whether it be the STEM subjects, academic subjects, vocational subjects, work experience. And one of the things I certainly think is important is then to build into the way in which teams operate. So when they sit down and plan the curriculum and review the curriculum, is that you foster that spirit of team review and reflection around how English and Maths can be embedded into schemes of learning as a normal part of the planning of curriculum or the normal part of team meetings. So for example, giving the staff in a vocational area the opportunity to identify naturally occurring opportunities to embed, or on some occasions to identify where chances have been missed, and then to make sure that in future planning, in the scheme of learning for example, and in the lesson plans that's being addressed. As well as using appropriate external sources of expertise, such as Sue, that's obviously working with me today, Joanne Miles, some of you know, who's working with us, Maths in Education and various sources from them, as well as the ETF. So from that sort of perspective, flipping the core is actually just switching around from the definition of the core for funding purposes, because every learner must have a core learning aid, which is usually vocational and academic, and instead saying, well, a more holistic approach is to flip it round. So the core are all those enablers, those essentials, such as English and Maths, work experience, total enrichment, careers education, without which it's very difficult for some of those students to achieve their vocational or academic qualifications and then progress. And that emphasis can change as the level of the student increases. So as the level of the student increases, as they become more confident and gain more skills, then you can switch that round. So you can see that the core subjects of English and Maths and work experience are more important for students at entry and level 1, and then obviously as they acquire those skills, then you can at higher levels increase the proportion of time that's given to vocational academics. This does not mean, by the way, that the vocational academic staff are not involved in the delivery of English and Maths. That's a slightly different, that's a perspective on it. It's just with a relative combination of hours and peers. And that's also critical when you look at the way in which timetabling occurs. I often wonder, when I look at an institution's English and Maths policy, it says it's a key strategic aim, it's part of its mission, and then it isn't demonstrated in the way in which English and Maths are timetabled. So it seems to be English and Maths is timetabled in a haphazard way. Now I know that many of you will have a much more coherent approach, a much more consistent approach that says the first thing that goes on to all of the student timetables, once we've got roughly an idea of how many people will be studying English and Maths based on past history, is to make sure they're timetabled sensibly with their appropriate time slots. And of course, you're constrained by the availability of staff, which we've already mentioned is one of the single biggest barriers to embedding, as well as the constraint of appropriate accommodation. But at least by saying that those students that have the greatest need get more English and Maths, well delivered, contextualized, embedded as was required, but also to make sure that the slots are sensible slots, so that English and Maths is not tagged on at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day, although we know that in reality that is always going to happen because of the availability of those resources. So I think it's very important that that approach is taken at that level, so that you're also making sure that the English and Maths is given an appropriate resource. But I think also it's important, and Louise, you've raised this question, a much more holistic approach. A lot of the subjects we already teach, whether it be BTEC, OCR, diplomas, or whatever, although it might not require people to correct things like spelling, punctuation, and grammar, I think, focusing on those as enabling skills, which allow people to progress effectively in employment, is a different approach. And I think you're right, Louise, there's a slight, what do you call it, lack of consistency between what awarding bodies might want and of course what might be the requirements of an employer. But my feeling is always that it's the user that's the most critical. If the employer is looking for, you know, good solid numeracy, good solid English skills, including spelling, punctuation, grammar, then it's important. I think then if you look at the way in which those different types of staff are involved, I think that's also quite critical. And I know that in embedding English and maths effectively into vocational and academic subjects, it's using the staff in the appropriate way. And this is not a new model, but you can see that when you're talking about very familiar situations, it's easier to embed English and maths using the actual specialist vocational staff. The vocational staff, it might be hairdressing colleagues, it might be engineers, it could be A-level business studies. Whereas as you move into the less familiar use of English and maths, which is not contextualized, it's more difficult to say this is going to apply only to business studies or catering or hospitality or hairdressing, then to use the specialist staff, the specialist English and maths staff. And using that sort of combination of the right staff, again, helps to embed English and maths firmly in the minds of those students as a key component in their vocational and academic subjects, whatever levels those are at. I think also, how often do we get an opportunity to map English and maths to all the different aspects? Some of you have raised that you already do that with your vocational and academic subjects. You map the particular piece of work that a student might be doing in business studies or accountancy, and you can immediately flag up what English is needed for it, what maths is needed. But can you also make sure that that's done with things like work experience, projects, other enrichment activities? And we use certainly at Learning Curve a lot of tools which allow students on work placements to record with the employer the English and maths that they use in the completion of things like weekly tasks. So they're mapped over to the functional skills in English and maths and also employability skills. And each task then identifies. Now, we also use some of the standards because we want to prepare students effectively for their apprenticeship standards. Have a look at the apprenticeship standards, have a look at the assessment plans, and how you can then relate back that to the necessary English and maths, which of course is required for that person to be enabled to complete the specific job-related task or to exhibit the appropriate behaviour. Sue, would you just like to have a look at the second level, the second part of the operational plan?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you've highlighted again some key points there, Beej, in part really that everyone's got a part to play in making sure that the English and maths is embedded or integrated across the whole of the curriculum. What is important is that people do share their ideas and share the good practice, share the better practice. So they might have some good examples of something that's worked, something that they've tried out in a lesson, and I think it's really, really critical that people do communicate that. Ideally, English and maths needs to be on the team agenda. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be on everyone's agenda. It's just a matter of course, really, not seen as kind of like a bolt-on or something like that. What is absolutely essential is that the learners who are joining the organisation understand right from the beginning, and I always say from their first point of contact, what is going to be included within their learning programme. So whether they're doing a study programme, whether it's an apprenticeship, traineeship, any type of curriculum offer, they need to understand that the development of the English and maths skills is going to be covered, and if they haven't got the A star to C, or they're not predicted to, then that opportunity is there for them to study those subjects again. So it's really important that people who are joining the organisation, their parents, carers, everybody really understands what's going to be included. And I think that brings with it an opportunity to include English and maths in things like taster days, which I know a lot of colleagues actually do very well before the young people start the organisation. Obviously it's critical as well that you're covering an element of English and maths in induction, and everybody has some really good links with employers, and I think that is an ideal way to get the English and Maths message delivered again. So not only to the learners, but also to colleagues as well. Sometimes the employers can come in and give talks, and the careers talks gives a different idea of how you can then reference the relevance of English and Maths later on within the actual teaching programme. What's really interesting, and I've seen work particularly well, is when a local employer goes into an organisation and talks about the type of skills that they're looking for. So they're giving some incentive to the young person, helping them sort of like realise the benefits of actually covering English and Maths and why it's important for the world of work and again for progression. So I'd say it's really essential to sell the benefits of English and Maths to learners and to the employers, and quite often you can sort of kill two birds with one stone. You may find that an employer will come in and talk to the young people, but then also that opens up further dialogue so that then they can help you with work experience as well, and all the time you're talking about the relevance of English and Maths. So my main sort of message there really is make sure that everybody again understands the importance and that everybody has a role to play. I've said previously that it's essential that everyone understands this and that there is a high visibility of making sure people understand the importance of English and Maths in all the curriculum. These are some examples of some really good posters that I've seen used, and I'm sure colleagues have got other examples that they've put in place as well. Another example is where people will have, I've seen it in one organisation, people put up like quirky little posters as well and little examples that had jokes of it, where, for example, it was related to catering and somebody got the measurements wrong, so the cakes didn't turn out well. And there are different approaches, and again, it will work better for different organisations. You know better what's going to work for you. But I think it's really nice to see different posters have been created by some organisations. People have made their own, but again, it's making sure that it's visible, it's in every area of the organisation so that people are seeing and getting that message all the time.
That's great, Sue. And I think just to sort of emphasise that by operating at those two levels, that's the strategic level, and the operational planning of all of your activities that are part of the study programmes, as the delivery of teaching learning subjects, the vocational subjects, academic subjects, English and Maths, work placements, careers education, all of the enrichment curriculum, you're emphasising and reinforcing how important English and Maths is. And that embedding, if it doesn't happen at those two levels, it's very difficult to generate the resource or the consistency that's going to be required to meet not only the funding condition, but also, as I said, the quality condition. We've got great questions coming through, Sue, while you were just doing that. One question, particularly if I repeat it, is if you assess a learner at level 2, but they have no formal qualifications, can you put them in for the formal qualifications and count those hours towards the study programme hours? The answer is yes, because remember, the condition is in terms of formal qualifications. So it is therefore important, I think, also for that learner to be able to prove to an employer or for progression to higher study that they have got those formal qualifications in Maths and English. And obviously the hours that you allocate to them, particularly if you only have to do component parts, is hours that count towards the study programme, for example, if you use it blended learning. So you might find that a person you assess but has got fairly big gaps at level 2 in one or two skill areas in Maths, then put on the hours just for those skill areas to be met, and then give them an opportunity to be entered for the functional skill, or if they're there long enough for the GCSE at the appropriate point. Great questions. We've also got one other question just that does relate to the next bit, which is, I suppose, where embedding really should be occurring, that's individual teachers, tutors and assessors, in the daily practice with learners, obviously putting in the appropriate emphasis on English and Maths. The question there that I'm actually going to cover, and that is obviously, how do you connect English and Maths with the subject context when it's not necessarily being stressed in the subject specification itself? Relates to the previous question on BTEC. I think it's that opportunity to always give the learner a chance to show what English language skills they've got, what math skills they've got in a realistic environment, or at least in an opportunity to demonstrate how they've extended or improved their English and math skills since they first started. I think one of the reasons we're doing that is because if you look at the Key Stage 5 performance indicators, and ones that are introduced obviously this year, one of the important ones is how do students show, and how can you evidence show, that their English and math skills have improved from the start point, something we've said several times. And therefore any evidence that you've got that show they've done that, which then obviously goes into their CV and into their personal profile or into their e-portfolio, is something that then gives that young person the opportunity to demonstrate progression, even if it's not formal qualifications. But I think it does help, certainly in terms of the day-to-day delivery of programs of learning that's in the study program, that there is rigorous initial and diagnostic assessment. Thank you, and you've all commented on that. And then you use that initial assessment to plan lessons, the individual plan of work for that individual. And as Sue said before, important that you individualize those targets. Now, I know we do this a lot with trainees, and we do it with apprentices, because of the method of delivery is not often face-to-face, or a large amount of deliveries in the workplace. So I think to extend that to all individual learners, whether they're classroom-based or work-based. What has worked really well if you want that really day-to-day experience of English and maths, is situating it in familiar environments, and even teaching elements that are unfamiliar. So, for example, using a STEM centre, not just to teach the maths that's appropriate to science and technology, but also the English and the communication and employment skills. Again, hairdressing salons. And what we found is where students are actually experiencing the English and maths, even when delivered by English and maths experts or specialists, but done in the environment that they most frequently use, it has worked well. I know, again, there's theory of constraints that says not all of those rooms are ideal for groups of students to work in, but often they will have a room, a general classroom, where they would do some of the underpinning knowledge for their vocational studies. And I think connecting English and maths with subject content has been a theme all the way through. And there's loads of examples, lots of it available to you. But I think what's important, as Sue said, is that at the strategic level and at the operational planning level, time is made available for that. And it's not always something you have to tag on at the end of the day or do, over the weekend. And certainly my feeling now is that as I look as a governor and as a senior manager, increasingly I'm looking at releasing resources to staff, to teaching staff, to tutorial staff, assessing staff. For example, when we lose a senior manager or whenever we have some changes in structure, to make sure that more of that money is then reinvested in improving the skills of teaching and supporting English and maths. And I think, again, the effective use of e-learning materials of stretch and challenge. For example, we use target skills. I know some of you use other materials, learning at college, which allows some of those students who want to convert functional skills to GCSEs or to get higher grades is a good use of e-learning materials. I think the use of social media generally, there's some excellent examples of how that's been embedded in, and again, if you look at maths in education or look at some of the work that's been done by the ETF projects, you'll see that using Google Drive and Twitter effectively has not only increased those language skills in English, but also collaborative working, etc. But I think it all starts by making sure, and it's an often frequently mentioned criticism of providers by inspectors, is that initial assessment was not rigorous and effective enough, and that learners weren't placed at the appropriate level quite quickly. So that the longer it takes to put the students on the appropriate level of program, as you can see here, I've got 100 learners in hairdressing. By week 7, certainly well before week 7, but certainly by week 7 was the last day, they were all on the appropriate level, whether it be level 2 right down to entry 2, and then would be taught appropriately. And I think, again, where you've got significant mixed levels well after the initial point, there are more difficulties embedding effectively, and it makes the job of the teacher, I think, more difficult. So there's no replacement really for some of those things. The business as usual model has been very good for embedding and contextualising English and maths, particularly in things like traineeships, which, as you know, are a form of study program, but you can take the lessons from it. So, for example, whenever Virgin Media students are put in, trainees are put into Virgin Media, every job task there is identified against English and maths functional skills. And similarly, that then comes back into, when they come back into college for the 1 or 2 days a week that they're not with Virgin Media, again, that's emphasised in project work, employability skills, etc. I think there's no substitute for tracking, and I know it should be an essential part of classroom and workplace reviews, that how well that individual student, whether it be the every 6-week review that you do with students in study programs, how often in that 6-week review do you track their progress and their achievement in English and maths? And how often are those regular reports produced on each individual student, including their attendance, for example, at English and maths classes which are discrete? And I certainly, you know, even at that level of delivery day to day, we found that where some vocational areas have been really good at doing it, have got really good models of embedding, that goes all the way back through to the plan of the curriculum and the strategic commitment. That seems to have worked well. And for example, in traineeships, we found again that in some providers, the greater commitment to English and maths was rewarded by then making sure that the learners would be ready for the work placement. In other words, by making sure that for an intensive period of time, English and maths was delivered to those trainees. And then when they were job ready, when they had the right level of English and maths skills, then they went on the work placement. So there was a sense of reward, a sense of incentive, but also it made sure that when they went on the work placement, the skills that the employer required in terms of English and maths were demonstrated and they wouldn't be left out. So you're guaranteeing much greater success there. And I think that's very, very critical. And I think it's very important, is quite significant here, because when we're saying that we're looking at developing those skills, and I mean there are, you know, the terminology is quite critical. We've been talking about English and maths because very much about the emphasis in study programs. But obviously what we're also emphasising here is the application of those literacy and numeracy skills across a whole range of different functions, a whole range of different experiences. So it's not just in the individual lessons and it's not just in the work placement, it actually permeates all the way through. So what about, Sue, what kind of examples of effective embedding have you seen of English and maths?
Well, these are just a couple that we've got up here on the slide now of some things that I've seen, and I'm sure colleagues will have lots of other examples as well, so it would be really good to hear different things that people are doing. Whenever I'm working with organisations, I always sort of say to them, just have a think about what actually happens. Really go for the naturally occurring opportunities, and quite often, you know, you just need a couple of moments to think, actually, yeah, we do that, you know, and I have seen some great things happening. So here we've got an example of the embedding of the mathematical skills. So in the catering area, you can ask the students to calculate the ingredients for you know, different portion sizes. So for example, you know, if they're doing a meal for 5 people, then how are the ingredients going to change? If they're then doing a meal, you know, for larger numbers, for 20, if they're doing covers, you know, for a big sort of few hundreds, a sit-down meal. So there are lots of things that you would do naturally anyway, and it does actually give you that opportunity to bring in the mathematical skills. Again, anybody in the construction, the engineering, you know, all areas really, and this is an example from plumbing, where I've seen colleagues look at the different scale and diameters in measurements. And then what was particularly interesting as well was getting students to remember multiplication tables when they were doing warm-ups for performing arts. So they were counting, they got to do their beats and things like that. So that was really good for the performing arts and the dance students. And I think people will automatically say, oh, it's harder to do mathematics. but really there are so many examples that we do all the time. In the English area, again, I've seen performing arts lessons actually use a word game, and that gave the learners a really good understanding of punctuation, how to convey the feelings and emotions when doing a monologue, because obviously if they didn't get that right, then they weren't going to be very effective when they were performing. So that enabled the learners to demonstrate their understanding, and then they could use those examples with their peers as well. So saying there are lots and lots of opportunities, and most colleagues will have some great examples of things that they've used. So I think if we look at other areas of what actually works well, we know that we do get a lot of people coming into the organisations who, as I mentioned previously, don't want to do English and maths. Again, you know, they see it as that they've already done this, they've done this for so many years. So I think that's where, if you've got a really good blend of your specialist teachers and advisors working together with the vocational staff, then the teaching and learning strategies will take on a whole new meaning, because it's important that we're planning right from the beginning about what's going to work for the different learners. If possible, then I think doing different groupings for the learners works particularly well, and I know with that will come a number of constraints depending on physical and human resources as well. But if you can have more of the same students from the curriculum area working together in their English or their maths sessions, then that is, there's lots and lots of research to show that that does actually work particularly well. And again, if you've got the opportunity to do different streaming as well, works particularly effectively.
Just a question, just before you move on, Sue, just before, actually you just take two good questions there. There was a question from one of our colleagues who says, we haven't got enough students to be able to stream them by level in a vocational area. You know, I gave the example of the 100 hairdressers who started off all together, and then we put them into, you know, 9 or 10 different groups by level of ability. If we haven't got that facility, we've only got one hairdressing group, and they're of varying abilities, how do you suggest that's dealt with at that very functional level?
Okay. Oh, yeah, I mean, I do feel for colleagues, because it is hard. I mean, you know, what I've said there is where people have got larger numbers, so they've got that opportunity. If it's not available, then there are a whole range of other things that you could have a look at, you know, including things like e-learning and some of the different products and packages that are available as well. And it may be that by introducing things like that, then you can effectively put the differentiation in place within that particular lesson, and still have the learners from the same curriculum grouping together. So at least then that, you know, they can see more relevant examples being used. So that could be one area that could help particularly.
And also, if you have got learners with significant difficulties, don't forget, of course, you've also got additional learning support with literacy and numeracy needs. So again, you might have learning support assistants in that group to help those learners who require maybe a bit more support. But you also said something about locating, you know, getting that right mix of specialist staff and vocational staff. What's your view on, and it's a question that's just come up while you were talking, what's your view on English and maths staff being located in vocational staff rooms as opposed to in their own sort of English and maths staff? Have you seen that work well or not work well?
I've seen it in both. I know that sounds a bit kind of like sitting on the fence, really, doesn't it? My personal preference is that I think that's really good. But I understand from other colleagues' perspective that the English and Maths specialists maybe want to, you know, talk and be with their own sort of subject areas as well. I suppose really the way it's worth trying. It is what I'd say, really. You know, and be prepared for change and to get feedback from people and from team members to see what's actually working. But if we're talking about really integrating and embedding English and Maths within the study programme, and it becomes a key focus and a key element of that programme, then I think it's a really good thing to try, because then those specialists, and you know, we call them specialists because they do have a different skill set. They know the detail far more than a vocational person. But by mixing with colleagues from the vocational area, each person is going to understand what the curriculum entails, and I think it's only by understanding more about each other's subject area that you can then generate out those ideas and get, you know, those creative juices flowing, really. You know, and just to talk about the students actually being in the staff room together is going to be quicker to solve any problems that I identify, rather than, you know, if colleagues are in different parts of the organisation. But so that's the personal opinion, really.
No, thanks for that. Thank you. Let you get on.
Thank you. So I was talking about the groupings, which clearly, you know, will work for some colleagues and not for others. But what's obviously important to consider as well is different motivational techniques. You know, we must remember those reluctant teenagers who need to understand the relevance of studying English and mathematics. They see it as doing it again, repeating things, but we see it as an opportunity to develop the skills for the future. So anything where colleagues have got good ideas of how to motivate the learners, then I think that is particularly worth sharing. From my own point of view, having worked with a number of providers, what I think helps particularly is by helping link the English and maths skills to careers, to goals, to aspirations, so the learner then can see for themselves, you know, if I want to get to this particular point, these are the steps that I need to do along the way. And sometimes it can be as simple as changing the terminology. So when a learner comes up to enrol in the busy period after the results day, and, you know, they need to do English and mathematics, they're there at enrolment, don't say to them, all right, so you failed your GCSE, you know, simple things like changing the terminology, changing the language, and trying to put a bit more of a positive spin on it. You know, simple things like, okay, right, well, you know, it might be that you got a D. Oh, right, you've done really well. You know, let's just see what we can do to get you up a grade. You know, simple things like that can actually give a different perspective, really, from the learner's point of view, rather than like, oh, you've got to do it yet again type of thing. So in terms of making sure that we're integrating and embedding the English and Maths skills across all parts of the study programme, again, including it within the enrichment activities. We've already spoken previously about the importance of linking English and Maths within work experience and work placement. People getting involved in live projects, all those types of things actually give the prominence of the English and Maths and show that it's in everyday life. And I think that's what we've got to work on much harder across the sector, really. You know, don't sort of keep calling it English and Maths as a bolt-on. It is naturally occurring, it's in everyday life. I mentioned previously about that there's been excessive focus on preparation for exams, but clearly, you know, we can't ignore it. We do have to get the learners ready to take the exam. And for some people, it's getting rid of those fears as well. You know, they might remember sitting down in a hall and just looking at a blank piece of paper, and by the end of it, it's still blank. So we've got to, you know, give them the right amount of preparation, but not at the detriment of them developing the skills. So that's where drop-in centres can work particularly well. Again, I realise it's a resource issue, but if there are drop-in centres and workshops that just allow the students to actually have the time to develop skills and keep practising those skills rather than just working on tasks themselves all the time, then that can help particularly. Again, for learners who've already got the C and above, then that's a nice opportunity for them to develop new skills, and also use it as an opportunity for some peer mentoring. So students who have got the GCSE grades, some of them are quite happy to work with their colleagues and just help and go over some of the topics again. So that is very, very powerful to, you know, to get young people working together.
That's great. Thank you, Sue. And a couple of things that just reinforce what you said. We've had a comment from one person saying we've been using the terminology of embedding, partly because it's about embedding a concept or philosophy across the organisation in a holistic way, from strategy right down to the point of delivery. I think the message that we were trying to say is that all of us are trying to develop English and maths, those skills, those key elements, what we call, whether they call them key skills, core skills, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But I think what is important is that whatever structure we create, consistency is the key. Whether we're using, specialist staff mixed with vocational staff, vice versa, whether we locate the specialist staff in the vocational area, which I know one of you is doing, and allow those specialist staff to then meet on a regular basis with other specialist staff to exchange concepts, ideas, and support. Some messages come through consistently from all of the feedback we're getting. Consistency is the key. And even when you've got positive statements, we've been looking at some of the inspection reports for the grade 1 and grade 2 providers, not the grade 3 and 4 providers. We're picking out what they said about English. And even where assessment of learner skills was at the start of programs was very thorough, for a few learners, and that's not consistent because that means those learners have not had the same quality of service. There were delays in putting on the right level. In addition, this is from another report, subject and vocational teachers integrate the development of learners' English, that word development, into the lessons effectively. Most teachers correct learners' punctuation, spelling and grammar. Not all, and of course that is again inconsistent because if my teacher doesn't cover it and then I can't fill in my job application form properly because of those errors, or that my written piece of work is not accepted by another institution, and I'm in trouble. The quality of teaching, learning, assessment and functional skills in GCS English is still inconsistent, and too few learners achieve their qualifications here. That was taken from a grade 4 provider and from another grade 2 provider. The majority of staff, so again it's not all staff, the majority of staff are now skilled, and that might be better than it was before, so that could indicate improvement. Planning learning to include English and maths and subject learning, and are able to make explicit to learners what skills are developing and practicing. Those literacy and numerous skills that we commented on before. So to conclude, Sue, what do you think of the sort of messages that this sort of conveys in terms of the implications for example, the specialist English and maths staff? Just a few words there.
Okay, well, communication is something that we've spoken about throughout this webinar, and previously we've said that as well. It's really important for teams to work together, to do the planning and to communicate about what's working well and what isn't. In sort of to coincide with what you're saying about the consistency as well, quite often the consistency or the lack of consistency can be dealt with through communication. If there's good practice going on in the organisation, then it seems common sense for colleagues to talk about that, to share it, to share those good ideas. And I think it's really important as well that this, we've got to support the subject staff to improve their own confidence with English and maths as well. And then again, those naturally occurring examples will become, they'll be just become second nature as well. Obviously, it's important to differentiate, innovate where possible, contextualise and integrate the subjects within the vocational elements. And for me, I think it's about assessing the students, give them the feedback, assess them, again, and equally do that within your own organisation about the strategy. Is it working? I'm sure, again, if we look at some of the other implications, we can see promoting, embedding, that comes through absolutely everything in all the reports that we read. And we have to remember we're not just doing this for the inspection report, we're doing it for the good of our learners, we're doing it for their future. By reinforcing the whole English and maths strategy, integrating it, relating it to the subject, then the learners will actually start to enjoy it. I think as well it's really important to use the correct technical terminology. So there are some of our curriculum offers that we across providers, we've got amazing technical vocabulary, so that's wonderful. Use it, make sure you're using it correctly, and have things like a word wall. So get the learners to contribute to that. Ask them to put a word up that they're having problems with. Do word of the week, things like that. That just put that little bit of fun within there as well. the SPAG approach. I love this. Spelling, punctuation and grammar. Now, we're not asking all vocational teachers to know absolutely everything about this, but it's just to have a basic understanding. So those organisations that have developed a guide for vocational learners have found that the profile of English and Maths has been raised considerably. And alongside of that as well, I would say when speaking, I mean, we all do it, and I'm sure I've done it myself throughout this this presentation, but try and use the correct language. Don't fall into slang. Obviously, there's a time and a place for people to use slang words, but if you hear that within a lesson, then I would say that's a really great way to actually correct it. It doesn't have to be, the Queen's English, as we say, but just make sure that those slang words aren't slipping in there. We mentioned previously, mark the work, correct it, feedback, mark it again, but make sure that you're using the correct sort of terminology as well. And again, it's so important, we've said it so many times, communicate with and support the specialist English and Maths teams. I think it's only by working together that, we're going to crack this, and it is quite a tricky one, really.
That's great, Sue. Thanks very much for that. I mean, that echoes some of the things that some of our listeners, unfortunately some of them have had to log off because again we've gone on longer, but again don't worry, those of you who have logged off, those of you still on, the recording will continue until we are finished, and obviously you can play it back. I just want to conclude with a couple of things and then maybe come back to a few of the questions, Sue, and can you answer a few as well in a minute?
Yeah, of course.
I think the key message here is that staff at all levels need to place a strong emphasis on the value of learners developing good quality English and mathematical skills. With mathematics, we said that. And that must go at all levels. So right from the very top to those people who work with those learners on even a part-time basis or an associate basis. When I say all levels, I mean all staff. I mean support staff, finance staff, HR, reception staff, etc. And I think one of the key messages that come through some of the reports, and also from the evidence of what works best, is that learners make better progress in English and Maths if they're actually reinforced in their vocational lessons. And that continuous, if you want, understanding is critical in achieving at the whole institutional level. So there's a couple of questions, and one of them is quite interesting because it actually relates to how well, using the experiences of work experience, work placements on trainees and logging that is absolutely critical. And you would agree that, again, every opportunity that the learners have to get feedback from their employer, for example, in a work placement, commenting on their English and Maths skills is critical. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and I think again that's a great opportunity to show the relevance of doing English and Maths, because if you can somehow link a task or a part of the log or whatever it is that you're using to record the work experience, so if there's some English and mathematics task within there as well that's related to the work experience they're going on, it's related to the employer, then what better way to show actually we've not been making this up. You do need these skills because actually you can try them out on the work experience opportunity as well.
And again, for Paul, I don't know if you're still listening in, Paul Matlock, one of the questions that you posed about traineeships, particularly for 16 to 18-year-olds, because they're funded for the whole of the traineeship in terms of all the hours. As long as you put into the student's plan the hours they're going to do in terms of English and Maths, the hours they're going to do in work preparation, the hours they're going to do in, for example, tutorial, no qualification need to be attached to those. The hours they put in for the work placement. If you think there's enough time to do a qualification, you can do so. But remember, you're funded for the total hours. Once that's put in, those hours are put together and the evidence through timetables, plans, etc., the scheme of learning, then that's okay. And again, there's no need to necessarily accredit those skills if it's more important that they actually complete the work placement. Paul, for a traineeship, the work placement is the core learning, and that should take up most of their hours. How you record the experience on the work placement, the use of things like an e-portfolio or paper-based materials, but use something like ProMonitor or something similar that you'll have in your institution to record all of those different experiences. Kyle have already mentioned that's a good model, particularly where you've got to apply the skills and then feed it back into the classroom activities. As Sue said, that's a really good idea. One of the things just to comment on is that there are quite a lot of materials available. If you go onto the ETF, the Education Training Foundation, and look at their materials, there are quite a lot of projects that have been undertaken, Sue Huntner, on improving the developing of English and math skills right across different age groups. So go on to that, Parvena, and you'll find it there very useful. If you're interested in maths and education has got quite a lot of good materials. A lot of these are available to anyone working in the sector, and you don't have to pay for them.
It's worth mentioning as well, Beej, that some of the awarding bodies that colleagues are working with have also developed a range of resources, so it's worth having a look at, and if they haven't, then maybe contacting them as well and finding out what they're doing to support organisations to integrate the English and maths within the vocational areas.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Sue. And for Paul Matlock, again, if you want, just get in touch with us, get in touch with Marek, and if you want maybe a longer conversation about, or you want me to come in and look at the traineeships, which we've had quite a lot of experience in, we're happy to share that with you. I don't think there are any further questions. Marek, I think we've gone through, I think almost all the questions that have been posed today. Again, really like to thank all of you. And Parvena, I think the most important awarding bodies would tend to be the ones that are predominant in those vocational areas. So I think if you look at City and Guilds, BTEC, OCR, what do you call it, you'll find that there should be a fair range of materials, certainly. And again, it depends very much on the specific areas you're looking at. Most awarding bodies, and certainly the larger awarding bodies, now provide, certainly, I'm very familiar with City and Guilds, providing a lot of materials in here in beauty, but also any other of those awarding bodies, if they've got, if they have a much more full offer, will have those materials. And I think the only other thing we want to say at this point, Marek, if we can, we'll complete the recording. But thanks very much, Sue, for an excellent presentation. Thanks very much. We had loads of questions. Thanks for all of the attendees. There was a lot of you today. We thank you all for staying with us. And even though we've gone 18 minutes over a time scale, we've still got 60 people listening in. Thanks very much for those questions. And thanks again for the presentation. Marek, have you got any other comments you want to make?
No, I'm just checking if there were any final questions that we might have missed. Because there were quite a volume this time around. I know we were struggling to keep on top of them. Actually, well, I will just stop the recording while